All right, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the panel, The Perfect Couple, Sports and Television, a title I came up with myself, so I will brag about that. Yes, everybody loves that marriage. Anyway, my name is Jacob Dittmer, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Oregon, and I, too, study sports, but I will just be listening to these gentlemen talk about it today. And our first panelist is Professor Michael Reel of Royal Roads University in Canada. And his paper is on Theorizing Sports Television Dream Marriage, Why Sports Fit Television So Well. He even went with the title theme. So he'll have a PowerPoint presentation, and then he'll be followed by Professor Shrader, Bill Kunz, and Joe Becker will go down the line, and then we'll take questions at the end. So, of course, we'll have to move now that there's a PowerPoint. So if you'll help me in welcoming Professor Reel.
Thank you, Jacob. I guess this is on?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I am trying to satisfy Janet by addressing the question that she's raised for the panel, for the whole conference, what is television? What I'm trying to do is map this onto a matched question of what are sports, and why do these work so well together? And I'm looking at people like Horace Newcomb and other TV theorists over the years as a definition. One of the interesting questions behind this, in asking what is television, is framed by Patty Scannell as what's the difference between a television set when it's turned off, when it's a piece of furniture, and when it's turned on? What makes television television? Now, of course, today we'd ask that in terms of when I am watching television on my cell phone, how is that different from doing email or actually making a phone call or the various other functions, the other apps that we have for that technology? You notice that this morning, even though there's a great deal of confusion about what television is, about it changing, is it still television? Television is the label we use for all of these different things. What is that? So I'm trying to turn back to some kind of classic sources to begin to address this, especially in regard to, as an example, and it's probably one of the easy ways to suck students into thinking about television theory, is through the application of sports. These are some of the topics I will be addressing. First, television as light. What is it that sets television apart? Well, when you turn that TV set on, it lights up. It is visible. It's visual. And this has a lot to do with what works on television that doesn't work in, or what doesn't work on television that works in books, for example. There is movement. Movement is something that television can do that painting, sculpture, plastic arts cannot do. It can move. Notice already we've got sports, visual, movement. The body is how we do sports. Sound, that the both diegetic sound within the sporting event and the non-diegetic sound added on of music and other additional elements are crucial to what we see and know as television. Early theorists were especially intrigued at the notion of liveness of television. Jack Gould, the New York Times TV critic, has a famous statement in 1956 where he describes this. Live television bridges the gap instantly and unites the individual at home with the event afar. The viewer has a chance to be in two places at once. Physically, he may be at his own hearthside, but intellectually and above all emotionally, he is at the cameraman's side. Liveness. Today, it's a very difficult notion because we almost never know, except in famous events, whether we're watching live or not. On the West Coast, Saturday Night Live has never been live. It's confusing. But still, sports are one area where live really matters. Suspense and open-ended drama. Sports work especially well for television because they are what television is looking for. A drama that, in the case of sports, no one knows the actual outcome of in advance. It is open-ended. It is worked out only within the dynamics of the game. Jennings Bryant and others have been looking at this element of suspense that holds the viewer with the terrible fear of failure and loss and the great hope of victory. The intimacy of television, from no less than Horace Newcomb. One of the early elements of the small screen size and the domestic viewing places that television grew up with is still important in television in the sense that it is something that people feel a connection to in ways that they feel less connected to movies and the large screen, the larger. This is then accentuated in sports with people like Roone Arledge, who discovered ways to make the intimacy of television a part of sports, to personalize the experience, bring the viewer into it, add, as he put it, show business to television. Continuity is closely related to this. Unlike a movie, which tends to be a one-off experience, except for the repeated blockbusters, television is built on series, seasons, repeated familiar elements. This continuity is exactly the same in sports. We have a team, we have players, they play a series of games, we follow this over seasons, and it matches almost exactly the conceptual map of what television is. The formulaic view of use of history creates this kind of shared collective memory that we can draw on, where every sporting event resides within a kind of deep reservoir of historical facts and mythologies, a well from which players, announcers, and fans can pull up many connections. They can pull up great performances, powerful narratives, all the rest that give it a resonance. The image of television is something also that can be now endlessly manipulated. When we see it live, we like to think of it as direct, but even the live presentation includes heavily edited inserts which move the image from the direct reproduction to very highly manipulated versions. This means that sports offer a satisfying playing field for such manipulations. The text. Stuart Hall distinguishes that there is a television program that is produced that should be considered distinct from the television text that is viewed and read. That the latent meanings in the text are activated, expanded upon, even opposed by the reader of the text, whatever the program may have intended. The involved sports fan becomes a hyperactive reader of the text. The text is polysemic, many signs, the death of the author. We make of the text what we wish. This can be text-activated reading, it can be reader-activated reading, it can be context-activated reading, but the polysemic quality of it means that there is an ability to employ an intertextuality, among other things. This is a term that Julia Kristeva coined to account for how texts draw their meanings from other texts. So when we're confronted with something like snowboard cross, a knowledgeable sports fan draws on other texts and says, oh, this is like ski cross, or this is like motocross, or this is like other races, we interpret the text, even a new one, in light of the text that we've seen before. Note that the non-fan finds the same text as the fan very flat because there is no intertextuality for them. The real fan is bringing endless amounts of texts and data and information to the interpretation and the meaning. Within this, the politics of representation become very interesting. This Bignell says there are three questions here. Who makes the representation? Who and what is represented and in what ways? And how do audiences respond? So we have representation and absence. What is not included? And in sports, these are some fairly obvious questions. We have an ideology underlying both television and sports that emphasizes, in the words of Fisk, individualism, competition, patriarchy, consumerism, capitalism, materialism, militarism, and other elements of the kind of deep structure of American ideology and values. This creates what David Rowe calls the media sports cultural complex. The representations are produced and circulate within a context of meanings that is governed by a system of power, offering legitimacy to some meanings and marginalizing others. Women's basketball for years was not on television. Sports like lacrosse, rugby, curling, darts were not on television until the explosion of the multi-channel systems where the most obscure individual tastes now find outlets. With the absences of sex, race, and class are significant and much considered. Women's sports, the representations of race, where we see, for example, a great overrepresentation of African American athletes, but you'll notice the same population, African American males, are also overrepresented in prison populations, in unemployment statistics. This is not proof of the great success of equalization. It's more like a kind of pathology of limited opportunities. And absences in television globally mean that the continent of Africa, many parts of Asia, many other segments of the world are not full participants in this sports media television of abundance. Behind this, the narrative structure is what works for television in general, the storytelling quality, and what is the underlying structure of sports as well. Roland Barthes says, the narratives of the world are numberless. I love this quote. Narrative is first and foremost a prodigious variety of genres. Narrative is present in every age, in every place, in every society. It begins with the very history of mankind, and there nowhere is nor has been a people without narratives. All classes, all human groups have their narratives. Narrative is international, transhistorical, transcultural. It is simply there, like life itself. Television and sport do such a marvelous job of exploiting that very fundamental reality. A distinction that the sporting event itself is the plot, and the television presentation is the narration, in the usual distinction between plot and narration. Barth again speaks about the enigma, the original question, who's going to win, the delay, the complications of can this team come from this far behind, will that star recover from the injury and return to the field, and then resolution. Sports have a wonderful resolution that is completely unambiguous. There are winners and losers. There is in this experience the reassurance, identification, and agency that television viewing provides. Reassurance that in sport and in dramatic media, the creation of cause and effect relationships between what happens and the outcome is psychologically reassuring. There is the identification with action and actors and an experience of agency in controlling this experience, choosing which you're going to view and participate in, how you're going to interpret it, what it means. All of this comes together in what Bart calls the pleasure of the text. The reassurance of sense-making structures, the psychological identification, the agency achieved by active viewing, the sport and television narrative bring together a kind of single, doubly participating subject who is getting this from both the television structures and the sport structures. Commodification is something that is certainly omnipresent in our sports television now. Brands, products, logos, pitches, naming of stadiums, selling of rights to bowl games, all over the place, so that sport in the age of television is a site of entertainment, consumption, and commodification. Now, this is something that I turn over to John and others to discuss in more detail, but the changing aesthetics of television in the digital era are quite interesting. Julianne Newton speaks of the ecology of the visual as a way of identifying what we're beginning with and what carries over. She describes the aesthetic of television as both creating and showing us our entrails, that we survey the environment through our television experience in actually very useful ways. The marriage is in transition, and Manuel Castells speaks of this as real virtuality as opposed to virtual reality. He objects to virtual reality because he says it implies that there are realities that we know that are not virtual, whereas epistemologically, language is virtual. It's not the reality, it's our reproduction of it. And so he reverses the label and speaks of real virtuality. And finally, in Nick Hornby, his first book, Fever Pitch, nonfiction, he describes so eloquently sports' ability to deliver what he calls unanticipated ecstasy. And more generally, Tanya Di Tommaso kind of helps us answer Patty Scannell's question about the difference between TV on and TV off, TV watching versus watching other things. And she notes its potential. She writes, and with this I conclude, to witness the incomprehensible possibility of the play of light and movement in a lifeless object is to witness the sublime event of life being created. We simply need to switch on our set to encounter and appreciate this continual event of becoming and creation. Indeed, it is precisely at the moment of instantiation that we become confronted with our aesthetic experience of television as sublime. We are in awe, if only for a moment, enraptured by the sublime and unthinkable movement of life in an inorganic object. Thanks.
Here as he prepares his laptop, so just wait a moment here. But it's Professor John Shrader from California State University at Long Beach. And his speech is going to be on live television sports, surviving and thriving in new media landscape. So I think he's going to carry forward some of the discussion that Michael Reel had on live television into new media landscape. So with that, I will introduce Professor Shrader.
Thank you. One, two, three. He's one of these Apple guys who needs to plug in his Apple to make his video work. And like some of you, quite possibly, he has an angel on his shoulder who's doing it for him. One hopes. Okay, that looks promising. Looks even more promising. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. I didn't even catch your name. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me and allowing me to chat a little bit here. I, like maybe a number of you in the room, am a recovering broadcaster. I spent about 30 years in the broadcasting business, mostly in San Francisco as a sportscaster in both television and radio, and joined the faculty of Cal State Long Beach with Raul Reese in August of this year after a number of years teaching at San Jose State. The question I guess we have is, what is television? Well, what will television be, I think, is the question that we keep asking ourselves, too. And this is one of the ways television will be in the future, and for some now. You recognize the two 800-pound gorillas in the middle there, Facebook and Twitter, but then Pinterest. You all on Pinterest now? It's so yesterday. I mean, it was invented almost yesterday. With YouTube and others, of course, we don't necessarily always consider YouTube as a social media, but it certainly is. It satisfies all the social media, all of the new media, as Paul Levinson of Fordham described it. New media is that one step beyond what we called new media, texting, emailing, and whatever. So this is sort of the new media. And I would be remiss if I didn't brand myself. Not only are we doing What is TV hashtag, but also social TV sports, because social TV is the tag here. This is the 50th anniversary today, sports people, the 50th anniversary of what? Wilt Chamberlain scoring 100 points. Can you imagine today if Wilt Chamberlain or someone scored 100 points? Can you imagine the explosion today? They had to recreate some video, some play-by-play. There was hardly anybody there. Am I talking too loud?
No.
Okay. They had to recreate the video. How about 20 years ago? Magic Johnson announces he's HIV. Can you imagine the explosion? How easy it would be for us to know right here in this room what's going on around the world. And that's what the new media is all about in television. Just a month ago, this survey comes out. Every 60 seconds, 175,000 tweets, a quarter of a million Facebook messages every minute, and YouTube shows 2 million videos. 2 million videos viewed every 60 seconds. Of course, about 80% of all the social media that we're talking about is outside of the United States. We talked about China and other emerging markets. Wow. So it's really the old media, right? Legacy, traditional, old, mainstream, whatever you want to call it. Stanley Domenico in Advertising Age said, basically, television is about being social. We like to watch television together with our families. We like to talk about it. There's some of us in the room, and I'm not trying to look at you, but we know what the term water cooler means. We're talking around the water cooler. Well, this is sort of the new digital version of the water cooler, right? Where we can sit around and talk about it, but we can do it in real time. TV maintains the tightest grip on our collective consciousness. We've spent so much time in media, right, trying to get people to go to our websites, trying to get people to go to other digital representations of what we do, and the panelists have been talking about television and the new forms, the delivery, the Netflix. We spend so much time trying to get other people. Television now and the big television networks, sports and others, American Idol producers, are trying to get you back to the television and using the new media to do just that. About 66% of all the adults in the United States are on social media. And of those, and I'll explain this for you, basically more than 40% of the people who are watching television are also on their tablets or their computers. More than 40%. 40% of the people who are watching television at any given time are also using their smartphone. we talk about the multimedia, multitasking delivery of our message, people are doing this on what's being called the second and the third screen. Jen Franklin is the digital media manager of Comcast Sportsnet in San Francisco, and she says 2012 is the big year, as most of the people I talk to about this. This is the year when social television becomes really big. But nobody's really sure exactly how that's going to play out, but they're all giving it the old college try. Whoops. This is supposed
It's sort of the wild, wild west right now for social TV. So I think until then, we all just sort of, we take risks. We try different things and see if it works. And if it doesn't, we'll move on to the next. That's kind of the exciting aspect of the platform.
Researchers in this area call it the lean forward group and the lean back group. The lean forward group, they separate them into two. The lean forward group are those who are looking for other ways to consume media, looking for ways to share, the second and the third screens to share. The lean back, well, they're watching television and that's all they're doing. But the lean forward people are looking ahead. Bill Hofheimer is a communications director for ESPN. And they have about, at last check, and they have on their Facebook, the meter rolls. They have about 25 million people who like them or friended them on Facebook. And their Twitter is about 3 million, which by the standards of Ashton Kutcher and the Kardashians isn't much. But ESPN not only brands itself as the ESPN brand, each one of their shows gets branded as well. So there are millions and millions. And he says, basically, we have to be everywhere. We want to be everywhere.
We as a company want to be everywhere sports fans are. So if they're on TV, if they're on their mobile devices, if they're on their computers, we want to be in all those spots. We want to be engaging with fans. The social media is great because you can engage in a two-way conversation.
Again, the line is either the second screen or the two screen or the three screen experience. The one screen, you're watching it on television. The second screen, you're in front of your computer or your tablet. The third screen is you've got your smartphone there. And, of course, sometimes you get all three screens in one with your tablet. So that's the idea. There are a number of experiments in this. A company called Omnigon has worked with Fox Sports for the last couple of years in a format called Game Connect, in which they put all of these screens together. You can watch the game. You can see the stats. You can talk about it with other people who are talking about it. American Idol has to, at this point, American Idol gets 500,000 to 1 million tweets during their program when it's on live. We've already talked about live on the West Coast. We know that. Those of us who want live television probably shouldn't be among the 20% of the American population who live in this time zone, but and it's been difficult. So this is Fox Game Connect. Even newer is a company called Snappy TV in San Francisco, which essentially has developed the software. The problem they're having now is getting the rights to the various programs. They use the State of the Union, the Grammys, and some others. But basically, they'll allow you at home to capture about 30 seconds of video and turn it around almost in real time. Can you believe what they just said on the Grammys? And it's enough just to tweet it or to tell your friends on whatever social media you're using, but you can see it within seconds, within minutes, depending on how fast you are in working on it. So, basically, the task of most people in television sports, and that's what we're talking about, most people in television sports, is to try and figure out a way to make all of this happen. And, of course, it's about ratings. It's about audience. We're learning how to measure audience. Nielsen is working with others on how to measure audience related to the number of social media hits that a television program gets. That's the next frontier. We've already talked about this being the wild, wild west, but certainly they're all trying very hard.
Sports plays a pretty interesting and dynamic role in it, just because the user is so engaged with the broadcast. They're watching it live. They're looking up stats. The three-screen environment is just so vibrant and top of mind. So there has to be a way to center that community. I'm not sure if TV is the place to do it. It could just be all social. It could just be on mobile. But I think that's where brands are struggling, is trying to figure out ways to sort of capture all three.
What is television? It's the little phone, it's the tablet, it's the actual television that you're watching, and the folks are trying to. So how do we do this? Well, Sam Taggart, an analyst for VaynerMedia, says there's a number of ways you can ask the announcer. You can show comments as they come. Some television programs are doing that now. You can display social media links. They do that. Almost every show that has any kind of an audience now has a hashtag in the corner. You can hashtag it. You all are doing that right now. And you can feature player profiles in games. Roxy Bernstein is an announcer, and 30-something announcer who says that they're doing what they can within some limits to take advantage of this.
I think there is, because there's a lot of stuff that can be interactive, and the fans want to be a part of what's going on. And maybe you have a Twitter conversation with somebody, or during the course of a game. That's going to happen, and sometimes you see it. I've seen it in some places where they'll have a crawler at the bottom of the screen where they'll have active tweets going on about the game that people are watching.
The problem is that announcers don't want to be distracted by the social media job obligation they have, but the audience understands it. Ben Grossman wrote in Broadcasting and Cable last year that basically the announcers, in fact, the title of the story was "Producers Are Twits," or becoming twits. The problem is the audience expects us as broadcasters to have it all together. The old days, we'd go talk to the coaches, we'd show up at the game, we'd announce the game, and afterwards we find out that the guy had an ACL tear or that his girlfriend was mad and walked out on him. Now we don't wait for that. The girlfriend walked out on the third quarter, and I knew that 30 seconds after she did it. So how do we make that and get that into real time? This is where it's generational. The old school broadcasters don't really want the distraction of social media, but the audience wants it. The audience doesn't. Maybe they don't know it yet. Maybe all of them don't know it yet, but they want it because that's how people are communicating with each other now, and we have to take advantage of it. Seth Burton is a public relations manager for the LA Clippers, and of course, it's about public relations, it's about advertising, it's about marketing, it's about production, it's about programming. Everything we do is about branding, and we can't separate it.
I think you're going to see that even more, where broadcasters and networks will be able to use these, real-time social media to get more information out there, but also to get that immediate feedback from fans. What do they want to see? What replay do they want to see? Who do they want chosen as their player of the game? Those kind of things, and I think it's starting to happen, but I really think that there's a lot more that can be done. The NBA likes to say that they're one of the leaders in the social media forum, and they really have been hammering that home and really driving that point home that social media is a big factor for the league as a whole and all the teams and all of our broadcast partners.
This is something I'm sure I don't have to tell any of you. This is how a lot of us use social media. We use it as a news feed. We use it as a research tool. And we just create a stable of people who we follow, who we trust, who talk about the same things we talk about, who from people who do pop culture to people who do serious research. And this is the way a lot of folks in the professional sports business are doing it. Whit Haskell is a VP of business and marketing for Fox Soccer, and basically says, I don't tweet, but I'm there all the time and I check it all the time. And I'm going to skip right past, because that's what we have to do in broadcast sometimes, is just skip right past the next one. Oops. We didn't want to skip past that one. We did want to skip past this one. Beverly Macy is a lady who writes about real-time social marketing, and she teaches social media at UCLA. And I chatted with her at a Starbucks in Southern California. Sorry, it's a little loud. She talks about the 3 tips. If you want to get started, these are 3 good ideas on how to get started in social media and to learn how to get in the game.
A lot of decisions are being made on spending dollars in marketing, and if the decision maker doesn't understand the platform, it's not going to happen. So there's a big disconnect inside of well-entrenched enterprises like television studios and that type of thing. So getting educated is number 1. Number 2 is find out where your fans are. Where are the fans for this sport? Are they on Facebook? Are they on Twitter? Are they on Pinterest, the new platform? Are they on LinkedIn? Are they watching videos? Are they doing all of the above? There's a lot of data tools tools that will tell you where your fans are. Number 3, don't start talking until you hear the tone of the conversation. So many brands jump into Twitter and start saying, we have a special on Saturday. Nobody cares. Come in and add value to the conversation and give me something relevant or something different or something insightful, and then tell me that there's a special on Saturday. And that's what the fans want, that's what the consumer wants, and that is how we get started.
Of course, those of us who are in sports television know this and work in sports, that it really is the reality TV show. And that isn't just because we pat ourselves in the back. It really is. Michael talked about it. It's that suspense, that reality. We don't know what's happening. And Hofheimer says, basically, we watch it because we just don't know what's going to happen next. Unfortunately, with most of the live network programming we see on the West Coast, we already know. Those of you who watch these programs, like the Grammys, right? We tried to watch the Grammys on the West Coast. You can't go to social media if you want to enjoy the television program. But live sports is about immediacy, suspense, drama, and it all happens in real time. So here's your generational view of it. John Miller, former ESPN Sunday night broadcaster, has done the San Francisco Giants for many years. He did the Baltimore Orioles, the Red Sox. Basically, he says, yeah, I get it, but well, I'll let him tell you.
I feel like it's important to be open to the way media has been changing. But at the same time, I think you still have to begin and end with you're actually presenting a ball game, and that's why the people tune in.
What we all know is in this wild, wild west is that the guns are being shot, and sometimes they're hitting their target, and sometimes they're not. And the key, again, is do it, stumble, get up, learn from your mistake, and go on. All the research, all the people I talk to, everybody says, it's here. It's here. Social media and television. Social television is the term. It's here. One of these days, we'll figure out how to take best advantage of it. Thank you. Do you need this?
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you, Professor Shrader. Our next presenter is Professor Bill Kunz at the University of Washington, up in Tacoma, nearby. Title of his presentation is The Price is Wrong, Sports Networks in the 21st Century. And he's a distinguished alumni of our program, so here you go.
I need a mic. So I should have come up with a pithy title when I learned how Jacob had titled the group. Instead of The Perfect Couple, it should be something about headed towards divorce or something fun like that. I think there are issues. If you look at the numbers, and sports is ultimately a game of numbers. Numbers times winners, losers, that's how we measure it. NBC Sunday Night Football 2011 season, 21.5 million viewers. Monday Night Football on ESPN, 13.3 million viewers. Simple. Sunday Night Football is worth more than Monday Night Football. You're wrong. In the rights fees that they pay the NFL, you can see down here both the current deal and the new deal that starts after the 2013 season. Monday Night Football is worth $1 billion more per year to the NFL than Sunday Night Football is. Sunday Night gets better ratings, more prominence, has a better deal with the NFL in terms of choosing games and changing games and.
For the stream, we're going to try to keep you more on my coach.
Yeah,
as a
producer, I'm not good at this. But it's worth more to the NFL and ESPN, and there's a reason for this. ESPN, 99 million subscribers. They charge $5.06 as of 2012 per household. You do the math. $5 times 99, $500 million a month, $6 billion in revenue just from carriage fees, just from what they get from households. That's not even counting advertising. It's a very, very lucrative deal. And it's done in certain ways. There's an article that was in New Yorker a few years ago, about bundling. And I like the cartoon. If you want the ice cream, you need the carrot. You got to eat the carrot if you want to get the ice cream. And that's the important part of this, and it comes into a regulatory issue. I'm a political economist, having studied under Janet Wasko. And so it's about ownership and regulation is what I'm focused on. And so it's not just who owns it, what the property is, but what are the regulatory regimes within which it exists and it functions. If you want to buy cable, could any of you today go out and buy ESPN alone? No. If you like sports, you get it. If you don't like sports and you want cable, in most cases, you get it also, and you pay for it. ESPN cannot be bought on a per-channel basis, as are true with most of the services. And in the case of ESPN, contractually with operators, it has to be carried on the expanded basic tier. So it cannot be on a sports tier. Contractually, they are obligated to keep it on an expanded basic tier. Am I screwing up again?
No, did the mic flip off?
Yes. Sorry, Al. I'm a train wreck. What are you talking? It was a long drive this morning. So anyway, I'll try. Is that better? Okay, good. Sorry, Jacob. Regulatory regimes come into play. 1984 Cable Act, deregulation. They could not, local communities could not regulate rates anymore. The federal government took it upon itself and said, no, you can't do that anymore. 92, they came back in and said there could be some regulation, but it had to be at the limited basic level, not at expanded basic. So ESPN was free and clear. The 1992 Cable Act also brought into effect retransmission consent. Cable operators had to get permission from local stations to rebroadcast their signal. Why does that matter to ESPN? Because it's owned by ABC, or it's owned by Disney, which owns both. And so for starting in the 1990s, Disney would negotiate expanded carriage of ESPN as part of their retransmission consent negotiations. So they have ABC, which is supposed to be, they're supposed to be serving the public interest, convenience, and necessity, as we all learn, but they're using that to leverage additional money and carriage for ESPN and their other cable networks. And the last thing from a regulatory standpoint is the idea of a la carte, the idea that you can buy stations individually. A big deal, 2006 in particular, Kevin Martin of the FCC, the chairman of the FCC, was a big advocate of this. John McCain made a proposal in Congress, never made it out of committee, to force there to be a la carte television. And it's very complicated and very controversial. The FCC did one report under Michael Powell that said it would not be a service to consumers to have a la carte. 2 years later, they basically used the same data and said, oh, no, we were wrong, it would. So there's all kinds of issues there, but it's an interesting idea. What does it mean? Why does this matter? ESPN is one thing, $5.06 a month. But there are also very real local issues with this and what it means at the local level. Just about a decade ago, NESN, New England Sports Network, had started as a premium channel. You had to pay for it, which was not unlike many of the sports channels. NESN, which is owned by the Boston Red Sox and the Boston Bruins, switched from premium to basic. So everyone that wanted basic cable, expanded basic, had to get NESN. That led to, a year later, and the Yankees network. The Yankees started their own network, filed a lawsuit against Cablevision Systems Corp. in New York, saying they had to be on the basic tier. They wanted the 3 million households that Cablevision controlled, not those that would buy the expanded, buy it as a sports tier or a premium service. Went to court for the first year of the Yankees on Yes, it was not carried on Cablevision Systems. Finally, in 2003, Michael Bloomberg, at his palatial place in New York, evidently, negotiated a new deal, and it's been on there ever since. What's interesting to think about is what that means to New York now. If you live in New York City, and you pay $40, about $45 for their expanded basic, not only is the money for ESPN and others, you're paying over $10 a month just for local sports, the 4 local networks. And that is for everyone. I'd buy it. I like sports. I work in sports. Or I did. Or I do. But other people that don't would still have to buy it to get expanded basic cable. You have ownership issues as well that are interesting. Obviously, we talked about yes, but more importantly now, you have this vertical integration with cable operators and teams joining forces. Cablevision System, as I mentioned, owns or basically owns MSG and MSG Plus. The newest in the group is Sportsnet New York, a joint venture of the Mets, Comcast, and Time Warner Cable. So they took the 2 biggest cable operators in the area, or 2 of the biggest, and formed their own networks. They control the content and they control the households. And that is becoming the new trend. When Ted Turner launched WTBS and put the Braves on it, and Turner owned the Braves, it was in a very different business model. There were very minimal carriage fees. It was all about advertising and selling it. Even when I was at Turner in the 10 years ago, I mean, the carriage fees for Turner for TBS were still well below $1. I think, as I recall, it was 50 cents a household. It was minimal. And it had always been that way. But what we see now is very, very different, and it's impacting on the industry, the sports business. It's impacting on where it goes from here. 2004, Comcast, largest cable operator in the country, kind of got into this business. They went into Chicago and said, okay, let's do a deal. Cubs, White Sox, Bulls, and Blackhawks. Major League Baseball, NHL, and NBA will form a group. We'll create our own cable network where we control the content and the households. Fox Sports, Chicago, went away. Just folded. They couldn't compete because the only thing left that you have here, not the only thing, the main thing left is the NFL, and it's on a national contract. So local issues of the NFL are altogether different. Shortly thereafter, March 2007, Comcast went into the Bay Area, San Francisco, where I'm from. Bought a 60% interest in Fox Sports Bay Area. Okay, that was step 1. Step 2, they went to the Giants and said, okay, let's negotiate. You want ownership? Here. You give us the rights for 20 years, we'll give you ownership. I think it's around 30% that they own now, the Giants do. And then in March 2008, they rebranded it as Fox Sports, Comcast Sportsnet Bay Area, which it is now. So again, a very particular business model that is going on. Starting next year, Comcast Sportsnet Houston will debut. The Astros and the Rockets will own somewhere around 80% of it. And then lastly, the Laker network. Not lastly, there's many other examples. The best example, the Lakers. Lakers, Time Warner Cable are going into business together, 2 networks, one English, one Spanish, in the LA market. And the Laker issue kind of raises another question. It was announced in 2010, Artie Moreno, the owner of the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim, got out of his deal with Fox Sports Prime Ticket. He was getting $50 million a year, which is not, in old television rights packages, was not a bad deal. In February, the Lakers announced the new deal with Time Warner Cable. And then all of a sudden, last December, 2 things happened within days of each other. One, they go out and spend $254 million for Albert Pujols, the first baseman from the Cardinals. And 2, they announced a new deal with Fox Sports. And Fox Sports was concerned the Angels would go to the new Time Warner Laker network. For somewhere, it's been estimated at different places, 17 to 20 years, $2.5 to $3 billion. $150 million per year for the Angels. That's all. And so the question that you have immediately is, where does that money come from? It comes from consumers. It comes from that idea of basic cable tiers. It doesn't work. The model doesn't work the way they're putting out money to teams as a sports tier, a premium network, because not enough people will buy it, or else it'd be too expensive for it. And so that's where I kind of get to is, where do we go from here? Is the business model sustainable? Can ESPN, $5.06 a household now, a 74% increase in their NFL rights fee starting in 2013? Where does it go from there? Will disputes increase? MSG, Madison Square Garden Network, was not on Time Warner Cable starting January 1st to mid-February, as I recall, because they wouldn't carry it. Time Warner Cable would not agree to what Madison Square Garden requested for a rights fee. And then lastly, can or will the government intercede? Will they do something to limit? Because you have various people in Congress repeatedly bringing up this issue of rights fees, or cable household costs. Skyrocketing every year, every couple of years in Congress. They haven't done anything yet, and in part because of the lobbying of Disney and others. The people who own and control content lobby very aggressively against any kind of controls. Most prominent is Disney. Disney is making a fortune off ESPN, and it's based on this model. When I was at ABC in 92, before I moved to Oregon to study energetics, it was all about advertising. It was all about ratings. We do a show, and all our executives want to do is talk about ratings. They didn't want to talk about how good it was, how bad it was, what we did. It was all about ratings. Now it's when I was at Turner 10 years later, it was a very different model. Yeah, ratings are still important, but it's about the carriage fees you can get. And it becomes a major part of every negotiation they do. That's all. Thank you. Sorry about the mic, Al. You know me, train wreck.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, if you'll join me back on stage, and that way we can be prepared for our last speaker here. Is that blank on? Sorry. Okay. You can have a seat there, or you can chat up here if you want. Whichever you prefer.
This will be fun.
Okay. Excellent. All right. Oh, I should probably sit. All right. Well, our final panelist is Joe Becker from Kgw Sports, and he'll be talking about, his job as a sports anchor and reporter, and hopefully giving us some context and perspective for what we just discussed. So.
Well, I will talk about the sports broadcasting. I won't maybe go the whole 15 minutes, so maybe you can ask some questions about what you're more interested in. But I started in 1979, so I've been in the business over 30 years. And for me, the job is still the same as it was when I started. I still go out, I do features, we cover games, we have highlights. But as these gentlemen mentioned, the technology has changed so much. In some ways, it's made the job a lot easier, and it really has been fantastic. As a matter of fact, last night, the Miami Heat game with the Blazers, I was sitting there in the press row, and Nick Batum, one of the Blazers forwards, went out, and a fan kind of came up to the press row, and she said, what happened to Nick? And I said, he cut his lip. And it had just happened, but the PR director had already text messaged me what happened to him, and it happens too. Sometimes I'm at home on the couch watching the game with my son, and a player will go out, and I'm getting text messages, and I know before the announcer even broadcasts it. But as far as the coverage that we have in local sports, big thing, like I said, the technology, and then the time you get too. When I started, we had 4 minutes on the late broadcasts. And now we have 3. Fortunately, KGW, they have a commitment to sports. Some stations around the country have dropped sports completely. They've reduced sportscasters. Sometimes they don't even have sports casts. Even if they do have sportscasters, it's like maybe 2 minutes. So we're fortunate. We have 3.5 minutes on the early shows. We have 3 minutes combined, and then we have 3 minutes on the late show, and we don't do scoreboards anymore. When I started, we did full scoreboards, Major League Baseball, NBA basketball. But you can get all that stuff on the social media. You can get it on ESPN. So we focus on local sports. And then we have a half-hour show on Sunday nights. And on the weekends, I still get 4 minutes at 5 o'clock, 4 minutes at 11 o'clock. So I go in at 2:30, I get off at 11:30. So my hours are pretty much the same. My time really hasn't changed much, but it's what you put into the show. It's more local now than it was years ago, because years ago you had to give them the national sports that they couldn't maybe get because there wasn't ESPN. I mentioned the technology. There was film. Then I went to videotape. And now it's digital. And it's changed a lot in the film. If you had a cart that went with the film, if the cart didn't go right away,
look at us like we've been there, right?
then it could be embarrassing on the air. But now here it is 30 years later, we've got digital. I would go live from a Blazer game. I could do a sportscast, and I used to have a TV monitor that I could watch, and I could be talking over the highlights. Wouldn't necessarily have to have a script if I knew the information. But now, because of the digital delay, we can't even have a TV monitor while we're doing our sports report. So you have to have your content timed, if you've got highlights, to match each shot. Then you have to hope that the director's rolling the tape at the precise time. Say, for instance, I've covered the Blazers the last 2 years, and Phoenix, and then last year Dallas, and you're out there live at the top of the show, and I'm just hoping that the director is rolling the tape at the right time, and usually it works out, and there's no problem. But sometimes you could say this is, so-and-so with a basket, and if they rolled the tape a little bit late, it could be wrong. So that's just one of the things that we have to deal with. But as far as the technology goes, as far as putting the sportscast together, years ago, sometimes we wouldn't get Blazer highlights on a road game. But now, because of NBC and CNN have these feeds that KGW has, we can get highlights of almost every game. Or if you had a story in a particular city that you wanted to get, you could call them. And if they had the video in-house within 10 minutes, you could set up a 5-minute window from that station, say in Tampa, Florida even, or New York, or Atlanta, and you could get the video in-house, and 10 minutes later you could have it on the air. So that's one thing that's helped us. Another thing is, as far as the writing scripts, we had typewriters, and if you made mistakes, you had to start over or you had to scratch it out. Then if you did another show half an hour later, you had to retype everything, and then you'd have to retype at 10 and 11. So you had to try to avoid making as many mistakes as you could. But now with the computers, you can type your first story in there, and then you could just copy, paste it to the late shows, and then you wouldn't have any problems with that either. But covering the local sports hasn't really changed a lot for us, because on Friday nights, we'll go out and cover high school football. And we'll have a 10-minute show, and we started our football show, I think, in 1995, and it's basically the same show today as it was in 1995. We still have our 10 photographers that go out and shoot the local games, and then they come back and we put them all together, and we try to have some fun with it and incorporate, maybe the food stand or some cheerleaders, yelling at the camera, and try to make it an entertaining show. And it hasn't really changed in regard to that. But as they mentioned, the social media for the national stories has changed quite a bit. And even local stories, we'll get tweets and stuff about different things going on. But like I said, technology is the one thing that's changed most of the coverage, I'd say, on the national level for us. But my job really hasn't changed a whole lot as far as covering the sports. So there you go.
Great. Thank you. All right. Well, thanks to our panelists. I'm sure they're ready to answer questions if there are any out there. So, yes, sir. Go ahead.
Yes, Professor Rial. Question about the theorizing of sports on television as we move between different kind of events. For example, you were discussing liveness. How does the theory of engagement change when we're talking about something like NASCAR, which, by definition, you're not watching the entire thing live, the same way you would with NFL football?
I don't have any definitive answer, but that's a genuine issue. For example, it comes up in the Olympics very directly that and it affects even the IOC's acceptance of bids from host cities, because a North American Olympics draws much better ratings in the richest TV market, the U.S., than if it's in Asia or Europe, where there is so much time delayed. Even though the network still delays things, even when it's in Vancouver, they can do enough live, and it fits in much more easily. And there's even manipulation of the events, like the Seoul games were called the breakfast games because they put so many events early in the morning that would never be at that time otherwise, so that it would fit the North American television market. So it's a very real issue. It is becoming so confusing now that, except for major events, it's very hard to know what's live and what's not. The key for television sports is taking it as live. That you protect yourself from hearing a score because you've DVR'd it. And so you go through this kind of strange antisocial behavior, all those factors.
Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I have a question for Bill Kunz. Yeah. I thought it was really interesting what you were talking about, this business model, which with a rising subscription costs might cause cord cutting. And companies like Netflix talk about how sports is what will keep people from cord cutting. So it's a very calculated strategy. But I was wondering if you could maybe comment on advertising, because sports audiences are one of the few audiences where you can really congregate or aggregate a lot of people at once for a live event, and how you see that sort of working into this whole business.
Well, I mean, it's definitely, for broadcast, it's everything. The Super Bowl, they got $3 million of 30, and it's still, and I know one of the things that was interesting during the Olympics in Vancouver, and I was producing the curling, which was on MSNBC, USA, I don't remember which ones, but like the value of the advertising there was almost nothing. It was all in the primetime advertising. And the advertising still is so very important for broadcast, whereas in cable it's more of a split because they have the carriage fees. And so it's not that the advertising is not important, it is. And and one thing I saw, ESPN, it's about equal. So it's $6 billion in subscribers, and somewhere around there in advertising. So it's still very significant, but they have that second revenue stream, whereas retransmission consent, one estimate I saw, NBC this year will bring in $24 million total, and maybe in 10 years be somewhere around $250 million in transmission fees, which are now a new thing. But for them, advertising's everything.
Do you have any sense of the CPMs for cable sports are going up?
It's ESPN is good. They're very good, but it's the question is, can they maintain and keep? And to a degree, their rights fees that they're paying to the NFL is predicated on 10% increase. I mean, in 2006 when they started carrying Monday Night Football, their carriage fees were $3.25 an hour a household. With the rate of inflation now be around $3.60, somewhere around there, and it's $5.06. So they're well beyond the rate of inflation. At some point, that I don't know if that can still keep going.
I just have a question or comment. I don't want to jump in your area here, but the Turner guys, too bad Mr. Oppenheim isn't here, because the Turner folks, you got to believe, are wondering how they're going to do this. They get about $1.50 or so for their $1.50, something like that, and oftentimes get higher ratings. ESPN's not the highest rated cable network. USA, TNT are usually higher.
And what's interesting with Turner is, TNT, yes, they have NASCAR, yes, they have the NBA, but they also have original programming. So for a lot of audience, they bring more than just, for the pure sports fan, ESPN brings the most. But TNT offers a lot more in a lot of respects to the average household, and they're at $1.25 to $1.50 compared to $5.
Amazing. Yeah. Teddy, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is for Bill. Even with this economy, it seems that people are willing to pay more and more for the sports culture. And when it comes to other things like oil, sometimes there is resistance because of driving. But are there any indications of resistance for the rising costs of sports?
Well, I think there are increasing number of disputes. And, what's hard is these are private contracts. So you don't know what MSG eventually signed with Time Warner Cable. But there are increasing number of disputes between satellite and cable operator and with sports rights holders, sports networks. And whether it'll come to a point. The problem is what ESPN would have to charge on a premium basis per household if they lost the expanded basic coverage, if they went from 100 million households down to how many would spend $50 a month for sports? I don't know, and that's the thing. But there are increasing conflicts between operators and the ESPNs of the world.
Very good. Yeah, go ahead.
Now that NBC has transformed Versus into their own sports network, their programming has changed tremendously. Do you see them starting to play hardball more with the cable companies and the satellite providers to get the NBC Sports Network on basic tiers, potentially with using the Olympics as a hostage?
Well, a lot of them are on basic tiers. I mean, the thing that they have to deal with, though, there was a lawsuit that was, and one judgment was handed down a month or so ago where the Tennis Channel filed suit against Comcast because they said the Comcast was giving better treatment to the Golf Channel, which they own, than they were the Tennis Channel. And so that's working through the court system now. And Comcast says it's unfounded. There's no basis for the claim, yada yada yada. But no, there's no question. NBC is kind of congregating their assets, if you will. Comcast, Universal, NBC, with the network, with all their, Versus, with the Golf Channel and the other things they control. And I think they will, there is a belief they're going to kind of try to compete more with ESPN. But also they have what ESPN has, where ABC Sports that I knew when I worked there is gone. There's no sports division. All there is a good friend of mine who basically just helps coordinate things with ESPN. To ESPN, ABC is just another platform where they can put their NBA games or other things on a Sunday where they can generate a bigger audience.
If I may, I'll call on the audience just in a second, but I want to kind of pose a question to the whole panel here. As we talk about these issues, I'm kind of hearing a couple trends come up. One is sort of the control of the content, right? But we're also talking a little bit about this sort of return to regionalization, I think, in some sense. So in terms of, there's only a couple national programs now for sports, and that's pretty much the NFL and the Olympics, and then it comes down to kind of your region and what you're dealing with. So maybe for Joe, I want to ask him, in terms of covering Portland sports, do you run into issues of sort of a cable operator that wants to kind of control the message and they kind of try and box out the local broadcaster, or are you guys getting easy access and that sort of thing? And then you folks can join in too if you have.
We've had easy access to all the programming. The Blazers and the NBA, they usually give us 30 seconds for every game, even if the game's in progress. We can run it on our broadcast. Root Sports, that does a lot of the Northwest football, they let us run the highlights. So we haven't had any problems with them. I know that the Blazers, I think, their announcers are limited to what they can say on the air. But we've had pretty good access, and we've worked really well with the cable companies and the broadcast facilities.
Okay.
Comcast owns NBC. Time Warner owns Time Warner Cable. DirecTV owns Roots. Is that correct?
I think so.
Yeah. So that, I think, is the biggest issue: is the corporate ownership of those who present the product, and for you, the consumer. Of course, the consumer is the one who always gets the short end of it.
If I could add, internationally, there are wrinkles that aren't being considered here. That in Canada, for example, which in so many ways seems like the U.S., nevertheless, that border makes a real difference when it comes to accessing sports. One of the frustrations of Canadian television viewers is that we get a Canadian feed of the Super Bowl that eliminates all the advertising, which is half the fun. So you get pirate, carriage of the American feed for that. But the sports coverage gets significantly filtered as it comes across the border because of Canadian content requirements and other management of it. But it still allows Canadian fans to be diehard fans of American teams and sports and such, but with sometimes real complications in access.
Good. Thank you. Michael, and then we'll get to you.
I want to build up, because you just asked kind of the question I wanted to ask, which is I'm concerned that with this marriage between the teams and the cable operators, it seems to be that what's cut out of that channel then is the opportunity for any kind of real sports journalism, because we've gone from
And so, Joe, I was wondering if you could comment, has your role as a sports journalist changed over 30 years? And I'm thinking of a story like the Greg Oden story. Did you get a sense that it was harder to get information from the Blazers or to get access to athletes over a more complicated issue like that?
Yeah, I believe it is. Actually, Jason Quick and one of the photographers from the Oregonian went to Denver when Greg Oden was going to have one of his surgeries. And he wasn't too interested in talking to them at the time. And there are certain times where it comes up where they won't maybe necessarily make the player available. The Blazers are terrific, but I think it has gotten difficult at times to cover certain stories because of that. They're trying to keep maybe the publicity down or for whatever reason. I do know in the old days too, when we were doing live broadcasts at 6 o'clock, we routinely get players to come on live with us, and that never happens anymore. But I think that's more to do maybe with the players and how they're paid so much. But I hope that answered your question.
I just have one thought on that, if I may. First of all, thank goodness for Twitter. We wouldn't hear a comment from some sports athletes any longer, or any athletes or celebrities or business people. The other thing is this corporate ownership. It's kind of like the ESPN echo chamber has made its way into local, regional television sports. In San Francisco, for instance, Comcast Sportsnet not only owns, the teams not only own pieces of it, but they're about the only sports voice any longer. So they spend most of their time promoting their own product and less of the time promoting sports journalism in the area. And that's a syndrome that is unfortunately playing out in a lot of other places.
And just from follow up, I think the ownership plays a big part in it. But when I was at Turner and we were covering the NBA was a big part of what we did at Turner Sports. And we had a green room, I'd sit and I'd have a box. If we said something controversial, the NBA was on the phone to me immediately. Most times one of our insiders, our NBA insider, his main sources were at the NBA. And so there was the idea of journalism within that context. When you own a rights fee and you're a rights holder, you tread very lightly because you have a long-term, oftentimes, relationship with them. And you got to be careful because they're not reluctant to let you know when you piss them off.
The other thing, too, is that there are so many outlets now that are trying to cover things. Unlike the old days where you might have had one or two stations or maybe one newspaper, there are so many more people covering these things that they try to keep an eye, I think, on who's going to have access to the information. You know what I'm saying?
The teams and the leagues really want to try and control the social media conversation as well, and they're finding that to be a little bit more difficult, thankfully, by the nature of the
Okay, well, one time for one more question, and then I'm sure you're all welcome to ask individual questions.
Government regulation. Do you see the day where government will say you cannot move the Super Bowl off of over-the-air TV, period?
I think it's a really good question. At one point in time, the U.S. government did have anti-siphoning rules, and they had very specific rules about what could go to cable and what could not. That was 1980s. You have now the Bowl Championship Series, which isn't really a playoff, so it's not really the same as the Super Bowl, but it's all on ESPN. But it's interesting when you look at the NBA, their contract, it says very specifically that the final will be on ABC, not on ESPN. And whether we'll get to a point where the government steps into that, or whether we're at that point where ESPN in particular is in enough households that they back away, I don't know. Because I think that, once upon a time, that was a concern of the government and of Congress, was the siphoning of sports from free-to-air to paid cable. Whether that comes back, I don't know.
All right, well, it's time for lunch, so join me in thanking the panelists.